We appreciate you joining us for this episode of Let Me Ask You This with C.A.R.'s chief economist, Jordan Levine, and Mike Falk, as well as
The
myself,
other
Matt Roberts,
economist.
the other economist. We have our chief economist and Mike.
That's right.
Hello, and welcome to Let Me Ask You This, brought to you by the California Association of Realtors. My name is Matt Roberts. I'm the C.A.R. Federal and Local Government Affairs Director. Joining me, as always, is my colleague Mike Falk. And this week, Mike, we've got a real special guest, a special treat.
Yes.
C.A.R.'s chief economist, Jordan Levine. Jordan, thank you for joining us. How are you doing today, sir?
I am blessed to be joining you. I appreciate the invite.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So C.A.R.'s research and econ team has had time to look at the first 6 months worth of data on California's real estate market. And we thought this would be a great opportunity to bring on Jordan and really just kind of ask him what is the state of California's real estate market? But I think before we get into, that question, Jordan, I'm sure you get asked all the time, hey, how's the market? And that's kind of all encompassing. So maybe let's just take a second. What do you look at, or what are you taking into consideration when someone says, how's the market?
Like when I say it.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, Mike's the perfect example because when he says, how's the market? It's because he just bought a house. It's most of the time
right.
people that are either thinking about buying, they already just bought something and want to know if they screwed up. And to me, I think it's a very simple answer. Like I always tell folks, the number one best time to buy a house was a long time ago. And the second best time to buy is as soon as you can. And it's, like a funny catchphrase or whatever, but I honestly believe it because it speaks to the underlying fundamentals of California, where we just have this kind of crazy imbalance between demand, where we've got this powerhouse economy, and yet we don't have the housing supply to accommodate that. And
yeah, I mean, it's interesting when we look at the market right now, it seems to me to almost be in kind of a like funky sort of place where there's a lot more listings than, at least there have been in the last compared to the last couple of years.
yeah,
But prices are still fairly high. How do you explain that when folks ask you that?
Yeah, well, I think you kind of touched on it there, maybe even inadvertently, is that there's a lot more inventory now than there was, but that still doesn't equate to a lot of inventory, right? We have seen a big normalization. We have, these all-time low levels from a few years ago. And in terms of folks just not wanting to move, a lot of folks had locked in those hyper low interest rates, and that's still kicking around, to be honest. Inventory's still tight. We had 3.8 months of supply last month, and that is a lot more than the month and a half or whatever we were at a year or two ago. But you go back and ask somebody who's been in the business more than 5 years or bought a house 5, 10 plus years ago, and they'll tell you that was, really a challenging market. Like you were really having to be aggressive in a housing market with only 3 months of supply. And that's why I think even with this, what I would argue is probably undercooked housing demand, like not justified by how strong the economy remains. Be that as it may, though, even with this relatively lackluster demand, you really don't see much downward pressure on prices.
So let's talk for a second about the demand side in the sense of where sales are. When you look at the first 6 months of 2025, how are the sales of homes in California?
Yeah, so we're up just a little bit. And actually, that's kind of a testament to how much demand is still there, even with all this uncertainty out there, and how much even a little bit of new supply can help. Because if you think about what's happened actually it's been terrible for my forecast. Again, even though the economy's held up relatively well, we had, the wildfires that happened in the first quarter. We had a ramp up in trade skirmishes with various, trading partners across the globe, lots and lots of stock market volatility, and actually still ongoing geopolitical stuff that's happening. And that's not my area of expertise, obviously, but these are all kind of curveballs that have come down the pike, and why I think even though the economic data is still pretty solid, home sales are only up about 1.5% thus far, when we were forecasting 5-6% growth. And ultimately, again, even though unemployment's still low and incomes or retail sales, or you name your favorite indicator, most stuff is still at or near all-time high levels. I think this uncertainty has taken some of the wind out of the sails when it comes to transactions. But again, I think when you look at the price side of things haven't budged much
Right.
at all. And that, again, I think speaks to the fundamentals, because we not only are not building enough, as you mentioned, but because of this, tax on home equity, because of the lock-in effect of those hyper low interest rates, right? And the fact that it's really a challenge to move. Then you've got our existing housing stock that is quote unquote recovered to levels that used to make us pretty depressed.
So, Jordan, let me ask you this. When you look at the first 6 months of the real estate market in California, has every region performed the same, or are areas performing differently? How are the coastal areas doing? How's the Central Valley, the Inland Empire? What do
Yeah.
you see?
Oh, so is this going to go on, Matt? Oh,
I
sorry.
was thinking, I kind of threw it out there as though if you wanted to.
Yeah, when you ask about the housing market, I really think of two things, right? Sales and prices. And when you look out across the state, there are some regional differences. Actually, despite the fact that Southern California grappled with some of these wildfires early in the year, they're doing a little bit better than the state as a whole. They're up about 0.5% or so through the first 6 months. The Central Coast, where I live, is the top performer. And I think some of these kind of desirable remote work, still maintain one foot into these large employment centers, are still doing relatively well. But the Bay Area, the far north, and even the Central Valley are down a little bit from where they were at this time last year. It's all more or less within a margin of error, but I think SoCal and the Central Coast are the ones that are punching above their weight a little bit.
Interesting. Any reason for that?
I think in general, the core employment centers have staged a pretty solid comeback. When you look at the last 5 years, we had an initial kind of exodus out of these coastal employment centers during the onset of remote work. And you had a lot of folks move out to the desert, to the mountains, the far north, lakes, et cetera, where they could work out of their cabins or work remotely during the shutdown. As things started to reopen and
Wait, hold on,
normalize.
hold on. They came to Sacramento too, and it's not just cabins and lakes up here.
I do
Yeah, no,
apologize.
there are real houses in Sacramento.
Although,
Yes, now
although I
Seen
will
them.
will say,
easy.
if you drill into the sub-regional data, Sacramento County did really well in the
Yeah.
surrounding counties. But a lot of that was actually not in core city of Sacramento. So even there, folks were still wanting to
Okay.
maintain access to the river for fishing.
All right, fair enough. Fair enough. Okay.
Right. It's interesting, Jordan. You talk about how, forecasts for the economy this year were kind of up in the air,
Mm.
and the economy is generally overperformed. And still we have kind of this, as you said, undercooked market.
Mm.
And what's fascinating to me when you talk about the fundamentals is that through a good economy, through an overperforming economy, no matter what kind of economic situation we find ourselves in, because of the low supply, the housing market has kind of almost been a little monolithic for the last 7 years, which is
Yeah.
as far back as I could think, because I'm, younger. But I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and we have affordability challenges. I guess I should apologize for not totally answering Matt's question about where the home sales are happening, but it's happening at the upper end of the economic income spectrum. The reason why we're still up by 1% or 2% this year is because the top end of the market is really overperforming, and I think that at the entry level we have folks that are really struggling with this supply driven unaffordability.
Yeah,
Mhm.
let me ask you, Jordan. So you're saying that the upper end of the market is outperforming kind of the rest of the market, and but you look at a state like California, and I just want to dig a little deeper because
Sure.
California is so broad, so
Right.
big. Upper end means different things depending on where you're standing. So when you say that the upper end is kind of holding the market up, is that the upper end across the state, or is it no? It's really the $5-10 million plus places on the coast that are also holding up, say, Bakersfield or Fresno, or is it no, the upper end area in Fresno and the upper end area in Sacramento and the upper end area on the coast as well?
The answer is it's both. So the higher you go up the price spectrum, right? If you're just an area, one of these areas in Orange County or the Bay Area where the median transaction price of a home there's 5, 7, million in these very exclusive neighborhoods, those have tended to outperform in terms of transactions. So you might see the overall market when we were coming back from the pandemic growing by, 10, 15% as a whole. The top end, meaning 5 million plus, was growing by 150%. So vastly overperforming. But at the same time, when you go into individual regions, individual markets, the chart looks almost identical to the one that I do statewide. So I have a chart that I show for the state of California, which has each of the price segments. And you don't have to be a mathematician to understand it because it's just the farther right you look down this chart, the taller the bars are, the more the market was growing. And although the numbers on the side change if we're in Bakersfield compared to if we're in San Mateo or something like that, in general, that chart looks very similar no matter where I go in the state, meaning that the more affluent parts of any given market were doing the best.
So actually, a question I did want to follow up on with you is when you're talking about supply and demand, it sounds as though, okay, on the buy side, the demand side, we see the sales numbers, and the sales have stagnated below 300,000 for the last 3 years.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Historic low, as far as last quarter of a century. On the price side, the prices have certainly slowed as far as increases. I don't want to say they flattened, but they certainly have slowed. I'd let you determine whether they've flattened or how to define it. But it's almost like a stalemate, I want to say, in the sense that prices aren't skyrocketing like they used to. And for whatever reason, sales just won't go up. They're staying at these historic lows. So I don't know what's next. Where do they go from here?
Yeah, I think part of what you're seeing is a normalization as well. Don't forget that when rates were at 3%, we had housing demand that was hypercharged, right? We got
Right.
up to levels that we hadn't seen in a decade, more or less, right? We were threatening 500,000 as like a quarterly average, which we haven't done for a very long time, going back to the prior cycle. And so, in some ways, I think we also borrowed forward a lot of sales that would have taken place probably naturally over the 2021 to 2024, 25 time frame.
Oh
My son has a guest here.
yeah, love.
Sorry about that.
No, that's
Uh,
okay.
Before you keep going, though, I got to ask. I won't throw this in the middle of the thing, but when you look at, like you said, we went from 20,000 to 20 million to 40 million. Shouldn't we be doing 500,000 units a year? Shouldn't
Not
that be the normal?
it should be probably 600,000 actually. I mean, if you want to talk about historic levels of turnover, we should probably be doing 650,000 transactions a year. The problem is while, population went from 20 to 40, new construction went from 300 to, 100. And so housing became a scarce resource that folks have held on to. And so part of what we're seeing now in terms of this stalemate is just that, again, inventory and is normalizing, demand is down. Again, to me, that's not a function of a bad economy, but rather just so many different sources of uncertainty, both because of kind of the trade and geopolitical stuff that's happening, because of the question mark about interest rates. For myriad reasons, it always seems like there's something right around the corner that's poised to make life a lot
Right.
easier
But
for home buyers.
do you think that's a function of what's happening right now, or do you think that that's just always going to be the case?
I think there's been a kind of waiting to exhale. Like, people have had
Yeah.
their breaths held for a long time in the kind of craziness of the pandemic. We started reporting on stuff daily and weekly instead of monthly, right? Just because the frequency and everybody's appetite for information and all the wild cards and variables. And I think folks have been waiting for things to, quote unquote, go back to normal.
So, yeah. So, Jordan, I get asked this question all the time. When is it going to be a good time to buy again in California? And I feel as though my response to that question often depresses people. So I'm curious what your response to that is.
Similar to when we're going to have 3% rates again. I have a chart that shows the kind of long-term history of interest rates, and
So not soon,
it's not
probably.
going to be set. Yeah, really, the last buyer's market was, when things dramatically terrible had happened to the economy. And because of our supply challenges, it really takes one of these big economic shocks to drive enough of a sell-off, enough of a surge in inventory, whether distressed or otherwise, to really cause prices to fall a lot.
And they panic and they screaming, sell, sell.
Lately, I've been reading in the newspaper about price reductions and things like that. And somebody called to interview me in the paper about, another economist comment that this was the first red flag, or that the red flag had now become a maroon flag for falling home prices.
Is that worse than a red flag?
I think maroon flag is actually a little bit worse, but
I've never
It's
heard
not
that.
burgundy yet.
it hasn't hit burgundy.
Claret?
Yeah, and again, it to me, it might be a nuanced point, but a seller reducing and not making as much money as they thought they were going to make is
Yeah.
not the same thing as prices coming down in earnest, right? And that the actual
Right.
typical home is now cheaper than it was before. And I think, although that's a nuanced point, it's a very valid and relevant one for right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, before we close, I got to tell you, Jordan, this was a lot of fun, actually. We appreciate. We've only had 2 guests. You're number 2, and
No, I so appreciate the opportunity to be here. This is the stuff I talk about, whether I'm getting paid to or not. So it's a bonus to do it with you guys. They're a lucky audience to have such great hosts.
all right. Well, if you're still with us, we appreciate you joining us for this episode of Let Me Ask You This with C.A.R's chief economist, Jordan Levine, and Mike Falk, as well as myself, Matt Roberts,
economist.
the other economist. We have our chief economist and Mike.
That's right.
Love. That means you've really ingratiated yourself. Now you're just on a first name basis.
Yeah, that's right. I'm
Exactly.
just Mike. Yeah.
All right. We'll see you on the next episode of Let Me Ask You This. Bye, everyone.
Right.